Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our show today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Communications here at SBAM. Happy New Year. I want to start off welcoming one of the many new members who joined us at the end of December, National Elevator Consultants based out of Lansing. Thanks for joining. All right, Brian, we do have a very full show today. There's a lot to cover since we took a couple weeks off, but let's start with the new legislature that's being seated this week. I think maybe top of mind for most of us is what are the chances that they will come together to pass a law to fix the Earned Sick Time Act before February 21st?
Yeah, February 21st being the important date when the law takes effect, according to that Supreme Court decision. We were quite disappointed at the end of last year that there wasn't a willingness, particularly in the Senate, to take up changes to the Earned Sick Time Act. Now, and so the House didn't pass it and send it over to the Senate. Now, we do have a new House being seated. There will be new leadership, a new speaker, and there have been, I would say, pretty clear signals that the House of Representatives does intend to consider very quickly potential changes to the Earned Sick Time Act. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something passed out of the House and get sent over to the Senate pretty quickly. However, nothing has changed in the Senate. And so I'm skeptical that the Senate would take it up straight away. In fact, I think probably the Senate will not. And it wouldn't be until there's some point when they want something from the House that there's some sort of a levered situation. So I'm afraid I've got bad news is that it's difficult for me to imagine a scenario where the Earned Sick Time Act does not go into effect as is, even though you probably will hear about amendments to this law making its way through the system. It will most likely run into a roadblock on the Senate side of the Michigan Capitol. And it doesn't mean it won't happen at some point this year in 2025, but the odds of it happening before February 21st are extremely small.
All right, so Brian, that's definitely not welcome news to our members, but we have been hard at work these past few weeks trying to develop some resources. So can you talk a little bit about what we're doing for our members as it relates to ESTA compliance?
We have had 4 or 5 people at SBM that have been working very hard for many hours on taking the law and essentially creating a, um, a a set of resources that could be used for implementation. So we want to invite everybody on here. And by the way, this is already registration is really rising quickly, and there is a cap. So don't delay if you would like to attend our first out of the gate webinar where we will talk about what will be necessary in order to comply. Our webinars to date have really been about what the law says, and now we're kind of transforming that into what it means to comply, what it means in terms of your business practices to incorporate this law. And we do intend to offer, at least to our members, the a series of tools that are very practical in incorporating these changes into your HR policy handbook, your policies and procedures, a handy checklist of all the things that you're going to need to keep track of. So we're in full on uh, best practice compliance mode now, alongside our advocacy work that we're still doing at the Capitol. But as we said with our opening discussion here, the chances that something's going to change before this goes into effect are very small. So we really do need to get serious, and all of you, all of our listeners here, or viewers, are going to need to get very serious very quickly on how to apply this, because all of the normal exemptions and exceptions do not apply for this law. I'm really very concerned that there are businesses out there that think, oh, I'm exempt from the Family Medical Leave Act, and therefore I'm probably exempt from this too. No, this covers any business with one or more employees. that is as low as they could possibly make the threshold for compliance. So it's not like 50 or more with the FMLA. And it also applies to any industry and any type of organization. So, for example, I've heard some say, well, but we're agriculture, so it doesn't really apply to agriculture. Yes, it applies. There's no agricultural exemption in this. This is a very, very far-reaching, broad proposal, and we really want people to be in the best position to make the decisions and the changes they need to make to be in compliance before the deadline hits. Again, that is February 21st. It will be here before you know it.
All right, and yes, so I dropped the link in the chat and on Facebook as well. So join us Thursday at noon for our webinar where we'll talk a little bit more about the resources that will be available to you as well. And then watch your email for updates on those resources later this week. All right, so Brian, moving on, it's been a little while since we had an update on the employee retention credit. Has there been any movement on those who filed for the ERC?
Employee retention credit. So this is one of those policies that came, a stimulus policy that came out of the pandemic. And the IRS last year, as you might recall, had put a moratorium on processing employee retention credits. They were concerned that there was fraud happening in many of the applications. And so that freeze on considering new applications lasted for many months, much of last year. And then and there were even some bulletins from the IRS that were fairly threatening. I felt unnecessarily threatening toward small business owners. However, that moratorium ended, and we had heard that the IRS had started processing these tax credit requests, and then heard a couple trickles here and there of our members saying, "Hey, I got an approval letter from the IRS, or I finally the employee retention credit check came." And by the way, they do appear to be sending checks in the mail, like paper checks, to so make sure that you don't just, I don't know if you throw out stuff that looks like junk mail, but in terms of from the IRS here, you might, if you have one of these outstanding, you might get a paper check in the mail. So here's what we see happening. So there is kind of we do definitely see a ramp up. They appear to be doing it quarter by quarter. So you may have applied for multiple quarters of employee retention credit. And so you'll get a letter. Here's how it appears to be going. You get a letter, and the letter comes from the IRS without a check or anything, just saying, we've approved this quarter. It doesn't mean that other quarters that they're denying, they're just saying they've approved it, or that maybe they're saying they're denying that quarter. But whatever they say about the quarter they sent it to you doesn't automatically apply to the others. They seem to be processing them separately. And then it also appears as though they're processing credit requests that are under $50,000. That what we're hearing about are ones that are smaller compared to the bigger ones, which I assume that the bigger ones are probably going through some increased level of scrutiny. So if you are waiting on one of these, it is something that I would say that over the course of the next few months, I'd be hopeful that you would hear something. Also the new IRS commissioner that will likely be installed here later on this month has actually made it a point to say catching up the backlog of the employee retention credit is a priority. So perhaps we'll see an even bigger speed up of this activity, because it was completely stopped for much of last year. And we finally see some evidence that the moratorium is not only lifted, but actual checks are being processed and retention credit payments being made.
All right, let's move on and talk about interest rates. So since we last met, rates were cut another 1/4%, and there are some mixed signals on inflation. So Brian, what's the consensus thinking of the 2025 interest rate outlook?
We will cover inflation and Data Monday in a little while, but it's not, things don't look bad, but they look stalled, and I think that it has given the Federal Reserve some pause in terms of of continuing the aggressive nature of the cuts that they were thinking before. So we've seen a full point reduction. So 100 basis points last year. So September was that, remember that 50 basis point reduction, and then a quarter, and then another quarter in December. So a total of 1%. It's not like there'll be a meeting in at the end of this month, 28th and 29th, I think, of January. It looks very unlikely that there'll be an interest rate cut then, and probably not in March unless the economic data, something changes. But based on how things look today, it looks like instead of 4 interest rate cuts that would total 1% this year, it's more likely to be more like 2, and probably not until May. And it's just this inflation outlook, while it's not substantively rising, it's also not falling. And if you're to hold my feet to the fire, it's going up a little bit. And especially that core inflation that they're pretty concerned about in the PCE index. These are the things that I think have really caused the Federal Reserve to hit pause. Now, there's another change that will happen. Of course, Donald Trump will become president on the 20th of this month. Historically, has been very, very aggressive in wanting lower interest rates as a stimulus, and there appears to be somewhat of a disagreement and perhaps a confrontation between the chair of the Federal Reserve and the president in the future. Stay tuned on that. And I don't know what that might materialize into, but at this point, absent some other factors that I can't see, it doesn't look like there are any immediate interest rate cuts. And if you're to look at the market predictions, like the futures on interest rates, it would suggest that the market expects no more than 2 this year of a quarter point each, which would be half of what we saw just in the fall.
All right, let's talk about some serious whiplash that we had 2 weeks ago, the week of Christmas, about the Corporate Transparency Act. The Fifth Circuit Court reinstated the injunction, but where do things stand today?
Yeah, and to be clear, this is a case that originated out of Texas, not SBAM's case. And so there was a local district judge. He put an injunction on this, and it was a nationwide injunction. Nobody had to file. And then the government, of course, appealed it to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. It happens to be the circuit that it's in. There was a panel of 3 judges, and that 3-panel judge looked at the government's request to stay the injunction, and meaning cancel the injunction, let the law go into effect while this is being litigated. Well, that 3-panel judge of judges, or a panel of 3 judges, said, yeah, we're going to grant the stay. The law's back on. And then the case there goes to what's called a merits panel. And it's another 3 judges. And these are the 3 judges that will actually consider the merits of the case. They're not just looking at the stay request. They're looking at they're going to be the ones looking at the case to determine whether or not this is, who's going to win. Because all that's been decided so far is whether or not the law has been stayed or paused while the litigation moves forward. And the merits panel reversed the original Fifth Circuit panel. So actually the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed itself and put the stay back on. Okay, so that's where we're at today. There is no requirement to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act right now as we speak. But at the very end of last year, the government appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the way that works is that every circuit, so the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, they're assigned to a particular justice, and it's always the same one per term anyway. And it's Justice Alito is the justice who will look at the government's request to stay the injunction, to, in other words, make it so the law can go back into effect. Now, Alito would be considered a textualist, and so I think it's highly probable that the review that Alito does will be based very much on whether he thinks that at the end of the day, the government will prevail, or the plaintiff, in this case, the the cop shop in Texas will prevail. The I, he's not a justice that does things flippantly. So it really will be I expect it will be a real review of the merits of the case. Not going to be able to litigate it, of course, but a real review of the merits of the case. And the decision on that will tell us quite a bit on what to expect long term, I think, because ultimately I do expect this case will be decided at the Supreme Court. But right now, it's just one justice looking at it, and only to consider whether or not the law is in effect while it's being litigated, or if there's an injunction on it while it's being litigated.
All right, so we'll definitely keep you updated on that. But SBAM has its own challenge against the CTA, Brian, as you referenced. So what's the latest on our case?
We did in December, we had oral arguments. Now, all these other things you hear around the country, it's all about injunctions. Do we have an injunction while we litigate the case? Now, we asked for that way back last April, and we didn't get it. And so our question was, do we want to appeal the injunction up to the Court of Appeals and ultimately the Supreme Court, or do we want to go ahead and just start litigating the case? Because there were other cases we expected would be seeking injunctions, we went ahead and we're plowing through on the actual litigation. So we're at a point where we are simply waiting for an actual decision on the merits of the case from Judge Yonker in Grand Rapids. This would be the first consideration of this type, the first decision. Remember, the other one is procedural, just on whether or not there's an injunction. This is the actual decision that we're waiting on. It could come down literally any day. I got a couple quotes from Judge Yonker that I was really quite pleased with. I'm not predicting we're going to win this case, but I could tell that our arguments had landed, like they'd been truly, really understood, heard, and considered thoroughly. Judge Yonker in the oral arguments in December called the CTA an incredibly burdensome law that imposes, quote, massive costs on small businesses, end quote. But here's the part that I liked the most. He had noted that it really bothered him that the CTA was designed to get around traditional Fourth Amendment protections like subpoenas. And this is the heart of our case. This is the main argument that we believe in, that we think will carry the day ultimately at the Supreme Court, is that this is it's essentially a search by a law enforcement agency for the express purpose of criminal prosecutions without any kind of probable cause. And so the fact that the judge described this as this law is designed to get around Fourth Amendment protections is exactly the way that we see it. He also was also really pleased at his line of questioning and the discussion around this and the oral arguments. He pointed out the judgment calls that businesses have to make, particularly around determining who has substantial control. This is that provision in this law where business owners have to report people as owners, beneficial owners of the company, even if they have no actual ownership in the business, just because they have influence over the business or they have decision-making authority. They call substantial control within the business, and there's no good definition of that. It's just you kind of feel your way through it under the threat of criminal prosecution. Finally, the other thing that I appreciated about his analysis was that he noted that actual money launderers and terrorists aren't going to comply with this law anyway. So it's not like the government would be losing, like, oh, well, anybody who's doing something illegally financially, they're the ones who won't be doing the reports, right? So that's the ironic thing, is that the government doesn't have a good way of knowing who's not reporting. So it stands to reason that you would get high compliance from people that aren't doing anything wrong and no compliance from people who are. So there's no benefit to it. So it makes me cautiously optimistic. I know that we have the right argument. Whether or not, a judge sees it the right way or that it's a big enough deal to overturn a federal law, which is a big deal. But But I at least feel confident that our arguments landed well and that they are being seriously considered.
Those of you on our email distribution list know that we will keep you updated every step of the way. All right, so there was a new law that was recently signed that impacts landlords. Brian, tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, this one is kind of specialty. Usually we focus mostly on laws that pass and affect, most or all businesses. But I thought I would just throw out that the governor just did sign into law something that passed last year against business oppositions, that it bans landlords from disallowing or making decisions based on source of income of the tenant applicant. And apparently what they're trying to get around is landlords not accepting Section 8 housing vouchers. So there'd be lower income people that qualify for rental assistance. And so essentially they're saying they're trying to combat discrimination against lower income people in housing. But essentially the way it works though is it would require that private sector landlords, property owners that rent out property, it would compel you to participate with government subsidy programs, which until this point you haven't had to. So just a heads up, we are not experts on this area of law because it is kind of a specialty, but for those of you in that line of business, makes sense to get to the bottom of, make sure that your applications and practices are compliant.
We did cover this a little bit a few weeks ago, and despite the opposition, much opposition amongst small businesses, unemployment benefits are set to go up. So, Brian, let's talk a little bit about the details. What's the schedule for these changes, and what impact do you expect it to have on rates?
Well, rates are going to go up, and proportionately, if there's no impact on people filing for unemployment, in other words, if the new higher benefits do not inspire any additional people to file for unemployment that weren't going to already. Spoiler alert, it will inspire people to file more. But let's live in a fantasy world and say that no additional people will file for unemployment because the benefits go up. The you would be really looking over the next 2 years, looking at increases of somewhere around 70%. It's a 70% increase in the benefit level. And so this is a fully employer funded benefit. So as people file for unemployment, they will be drawing more out of this trust fund. Assessments on employers is the only way that this trust fund gets funded. So if 70% more is coming out, that means 70% more is going to have to go in. And I'll also say that if we have a slowdown in the economy and utilization goes up a lot, the fund is not in as good a shape as it was before. It is still a couple $1 billion short of what it was before it was used as a pandemic safety net. So it will go up 3 times. One time is already on January 1st of this year. So it's already in effect right now. It goes up from 362 was the maximum weekly benefit, will go to 446. And there's an additional stipend of 1266 per dependent that a filer might have. And then January 1st of 2026, so a year from now, it'll go up to 530. And then 2 years from now, it'll go up to $614. So think of it at around $16 an hour equivalent is what it will make it up to. So being on unemployment will be the equivalency of about a $16 an hour income. If somebody was employed. So this is already in effect. Okay, this passed last year, and I think employers should just expect, well, it won't happen right now immediately. Over the next couple of years, you should expect that the rates will increase. And if this does inspire higher utilization of the unemployment fund, which it probably will, last time we had unemployment weekly benefits during the pandemic over $600 a week, it definitely did. So it inspired higher utilization of it. People were on it longer and even kind of lobbied to stay on it. The employer, don't call me back. I'd rather stay on unemployment. We heard this time and time again. Probably likely that will, that at least some kind of impact like that will happen again. And unfortunately, the trust fund is not as strong as it was.
All right, let's talk about house races. We were actually quite active in house races in 2024, and it was a record-setting cycle. What was the total?
Yeah, I had to double check this because I saw an article on it and I couldn't believe it. It was $67 million. $67 million for state representative races. Back, the previous record was in 2018, and this one blew that away. Back before in the previous cycle, there was one race that was over $1.5 million. And in this cycle, there were 14 races that were over $1.5 million, including the most expensive one was $5.6 million for a state representative race. The is kind of money that this type of money in local state rep races is so unprecedented. And it you did see a balance of power shift. So it went from 56, 54 Democrats had control to Republicans controlling now in this year 58, 52. So still pretty closely divided, but power shifted. The Senate wasn't up at all. So the Senate doesn't change at all, still 2018 in favor of the Democrats. And of course, the governor's race didn't change either. So the governor's office didn't change in this cycle. So this is we've entered just an unprecedented period where we saw, like in presidential politics, they go from 100 million to with George W. Bush in the year 2000 to Barack Obama's election was like 1 billion, and now we're talking about tens of billions at the presidential level. That has been rising exponentially. It has hit as races as local as state rep races. Blows my mind.
Those are some extremely large numbers, absolutely.
Sarah,
Um,
I think there were some other issues we were going to talk about, but I think a couple of things I want to cover on Data Monday. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to
all
jump right
right.
up into that. And so I'll run through here in our remaining time in what we have. So the first thing I wanted to cover was just the various types of inflation. So the consumer price index at 3.3 and 2.7 core versus headline inflation. But if you look at the very end, those little hooks, you see there's just up a little bit. But this PCE is the one that the personal consumption index. This is the one that the Federal Reserve looks most closely at. Again, you see the little hooks at the end where it's going up a bit, and it just seems to be kind of stalled for a few quarters here at this level that they want to get this. This is the one that they want to get to 2%. And so it's not so far off 2%, but it's just not at a point where they feel comfortable, especially when you look at the third type of inflation I'm going to share with you, which is the producer price index. Now, this trend definitely looks like it's going in the wrong direction. And this is like, that's the cost of production. So the others were looking at the consumer experience, the CPI and the PCE. Those are the consumer experience, but when you look at the producer experience, that's going to carry into it seems it stands to reason to carry into higher consumer prices later on. So this is the effect of inflation. So this is real personal income that you're looking at here, and so where you see green, that's where income growth exceeded inflation. Where it's red, income growth was not as high as inflation. So income may have gone up in those years, but pricing power, purchase power went down. And so this is one where you see it's been positive, but it's been in a modest level and definitely not has not been to a point where it's made up for what we lost in the last few years. Talking about a couple of income Michigan versus the rest of the country, you'll see over on the left. You'll see the country's weekly income levels, and that's been a steady incline. Michigan's have been lower and also not as much, that the spread between the two is getting wider. And then if you look at the right-hand side, these both came from Bridge, and they do some great graphical work. Bridge, Michigan does. and this isn't the actual level. This is our ranking compared to other states, looking at per capita income. And you'll see that our ranking has dropped down to 39th. And there was at the Great Recession. You see the Great Recession here. We had a little bit of a bounce back in the last decade, but then now we've fallen down even lower than before. Labor force participation, you'll see that trailing off a little bit. The national rate, you see men at the top, women at the bottom, and the national rate in the middle, it's 62.5. Actually, it's been updated one more time since then. So the national rate is about 62.6. Comparing that to Michigan here, you'll see that Michigan kind of caught up on our labor force participation with the feds. However, ours is starting to slip a little bit, and so while it's historically doesn't look bad compared to Michigan of the past, look how we stack up to our neighbors, Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois, all up there at the 65 to 67%, but even Ohio and Indiana, at least a little bit higher, but Michigan rounding out the bottom with those Midwestern states. The jobless rate, you see Michigan and the country both trending up a little bit. And so I'll go through these really quick. These are all things that just look like a little softer, nothing alarming, but just a little softer in terms of the consumer experience. The permanent job losses you'll see going up, and the temporary layoffs going down, which suggests that there are more businesses deciding we're not going to do temporary layoffs, we're doing actual elimination of positions. And then initial jobless claims you'll see are actually going down, but continuing jobless claims continue to go up, so longer term unemployment. And then the final slide here is duration of 27 weeks. So this is more than 6 months. And you'll see that the absolute number rising and the percentage of a total, of course, also rising. So a lot to consider with our with Data Monday. I know try to pack a bunch in here at the end, but a lot of important information and trends. So like it's nothing on there that jumps out to me like, wow, the Biden's falling out, but really also nothing that I would look at and say that makes me optimistic. I think this uneasiness that you see kind of settling into the economy, when you look at those numbers, you can kind of see why.
All right, well, thanks for that report, Brian. I do want to mention one final thing before we say goodbye, and that is that we have our first owner-to-owner event of 2025 Wednesday in Kalamazoo, and it'll be at the Airway Fun Center. So sounds like it'll be a fun experience for those of you who attend. You can find all the details on our website, sbam.org/events, but we would love to see you if you're going to be in the Kalamazoo area on Wednesday. Have a great rest of your week, and we will hopefully see you on the Thursday webinar and back here next Monday at 3 o'clock.
See you real soon.